The software that we use in Federal Student Aid is called Banner. And Banner is going to give us access to student accounts. And we're going to go over right now only how to log into Banner and then the few main screens that you would use when dealing with a student at the front desk. When you arrive at work, you'll be required to check out a token, and that token provides authentication for your login. The user ID we'll enter here is going to come from the back of your token. And then, of course, we'll give you the password that you need. And then your token has a button to press, and it's going to give you a security number. And that number is what goes into this spot here. Once we're logged into Banner, this is what our home screen looks like. And this is where you're going to have to enter the names of the screens that you actually want to access. You'll hear us referring to things such as RAWCOM, ROAStat. Those are the names of the screens that we want you to look at. There is a list of those that will be available for you. And there are also screens that you do not have access to that advisors do have access to. For instance, the form that shows the FAFSA data. Graduate students don't have access to that information. So if there's any questions about the information that's actually on the FAFSA, you'll definitely need to speak with an advisor. The three main screens that you're going to look at when you're speaking with a student. The first one is called ROARMAN, ROARMAN. And you will have to have the student's CWID. As mentioned before, if the parent comes up alone, the parent does have to have the CWID in order for us to access the student account. If the student is there, we can use other identifiers. We can type in their name, their social security number. This ID box is where you would put in the social security number, and it would also pull them up. And then we can show you at another time how to look a student up by name. But we're going to look at a student right now that has been awarded so that we can see what kind of information we can access on ROARMAN. There are also a lot of keyboard shortcuts that you can use to move around Banner a little bit faster, and we'll go over those at a later time as well. On this screen, the kind of information we have access to up here, although you can't see it in this video, is the student's CWID and name. This box here that shows the award year, we'll look at that in just a few minutes as far as if the student is coming up and asking about a previous year, or if it's the summertime and maybe we're dealing with both the current academic year and the upcoming, you might need to switch back and forth between years here. Once we've blocked down and are looking at the student information, here's their budget, and that budget is for the fall and spring. So if the student's enrolled in summer, then it is going to look a little bit different. The aid period here tells us also that this is fall and spring. When a student completes a FAFSA and puts in the parent information, income, assets, any kind of child support received, other untaxed income, number of people in the household, number of people in college, all of those things go into a calculation. And it gives us this end number called the expected family contribution. And we'll talk about how we use that to determine a student's award. These are not going to be as important, the gross need and unmet need. We do look at those a little bit, but not very much. So the expected family contribution is really what's going to determine whether a student is Pell eligible or not. You can see that this student does not have a Pell Grant listed in their award offer, and that's because the expected family contribution is too high. We do get a lot of questions about that. If a student's not eligible for a Pell Grant, then the only thing that we can offer is the subsidized and unsubsidized loans that you see here. I did forget to mention that this screen does also let us know how the student is classified as far as being graduate or undergraduate, dependent or independent, and resident or non-resident. So this budget grouping here tells us that this student is undergraduate, dependent, and a resident. That's, of course, why they have a smaller budget. The dependent status tells us that they're only eligible for the $5,500 for the year as an undergraduate student as well. Now, just because a student has been awarded, so this student has received or been offered and also accepted their $5,500 in federal student loans, that does not mean that they've actually completed all of the requirements in order for that aid to pay out to their student account. The screen that you would look at to check for any unmet requirements, we're going to hit Control Q to exit out of that screen. That's the shortcut. And we're going to go to what we call RAWREC. This is the screen that shows unmet requirements. And the shortcut we're using to block down is Control Page Down. So on RAWREC, we're going to see things that have already been satisfied and anything that has not been satisfied. You might see things marked at an R. That means that they are still in review, and we'll look at some examples of those as well. But this student does have some unmet requirements. In this corner up here, if all of their requirements were met in order for this aid to disperse, these other dates would be filled in as well. So if the student hasn't completed all that they need to in order to actually receive the award, there would not be a date filled in here, but we know that this student has because we just looked at their award. However, obviously they've not done everything that they need to do in order to receive this award to their student account. So this is going to tell us why entrance counseling is showing as not being completed. The student does have to go to studentloans.gov to complete both entrance loan counseling and a master promissory note. Master promissory notes do not have a tracking on RAWREC, but the student does have a red flag on their MyBama account. So they should be aware from that it's an incomplete requirement. But the only way that we would know that it's incomplete is either by looking at the loan, which we'll look at in another tutorial how to do that, or going to another screen that does show the MPNs even if they're pending, which again we're not going to look at during this tutorial. But there are a couple of other places that you can look in order to determine whether or not the MPN has been done. We do want to make sure, of course, that we're giving the student the most complete information when we're letting them know what else needs to be completed. The last screen that you're going to look at, and this student may not have very much on this screen, is called RAWCOM. And RAWCOM is our notes screen. We're going to control page down. And again, I knew that this student likely wouldn't have very much, if anything, on this screen because they are a first-time student. They didn't have any dependent verification tracked, so there were no notes from our data processing department. We don't put a note on the account just for having awarded the student because all of that's done automatically through our system. So this student at this time, they've not called our call center. They may have communicated with us via email at some point, but it wasn't anything that maybe necessarily needed a note because they didn't submit any kind of documentation. We'll definitely come back and look at this one at some examples of students that do have some things filled in on this screen. But if a student ever has questions about their account, these three screens that we've just looked at are going to be your main ones. RAWCOM very often, especially if they've got anything that's incomplete, is going to be where you want to check. Let's move on to another example. This is going to be a student. We're going to go back to RAWREC. This is a student who has not yet been awarded. So sometimes you're going to get a student come up to the front desk and that's going to be their question. Why have I not been awarded yet? Why have I not received my award for the next year? And this one is very clear. The student is tracked for dependent verification. There is some verification information, hopefully, that you've gone over in one of the previous modules. And verification does require students and parents to submit additional documentation to our office so that we can verify what's on the FAFSA. The student has not started the process of submitting any of the documentation that we require in order to satisfy that requirement. So if that tracking is still at E, that means they haven't turned in anything. We just need to let them know that that's the requirement that needs to be completed. If we were to go and look at ROARMAN for this student, of course we would see that it is blank because the student has not been awarded. The only information we really have access to at this time is the expected family contribution. I do want to go back to RAWREC for just one more second and mention that RAWREC does show us when the FAFSA was received. It will always show as satisfied and show the date that it was received. But sometimes there are some additional trackings underneath that regarding the FAFSA being unofficial. And in that case, a student would need to make a correction. And you can probably find notes on RAWCOM about what needs to be completed or speak with an advisor. If you hit Shift F7, it will automatically roll back for you so that you can either enter a new campus-wide ID or go over to that age year and put in another age year. We're going to look at one more that has some incomplete requirements. So control page down. This is another student that was tracked for dependent verification. However, we see from this additional tracking down here that they did use the IRS data retrieval tool. And the IRS data retrieval tool in some instances will automatically satisfy that verification requirement, with the exception being if the parent or student has indicated that they have more people in the household, then FAFSA would logically be able to guess you have people in the household. For example, if there are two parents, because they indicate that they are married, both parents are listed on the FAFSA, and one student, and the household size is 3 and 1, the tracking would be satisfied because that's very logical. But if there are two parents and the student and the household size says 5 and 1, we have no way of verifying that those other people in the household should be listed there without asking for an additional document that we call a household size form. So then the student has been tracked for that additional household size form requirement. That means, of course, that their requirements here for awarding or packaging have still not been completed. So if we were to go to Rohrman, then all that we would see there is that expected family contribution information, which could change actually if this household size form changes. We would need to get that in before we would be able to tell a student what they can expect for sure as far as an award goes. This student here has submitted a Graduate PLUS loan application. We see that it's at R. Again, R would typically mean that it's in review. In this case, we can go to RAWCOM and look and see the note that's there. This loan limit tracking is another unmet requirement. There are so many trackings that are going to be on RAWREC, it would be impossible for us to go over each of them in this video and discuss what they are, what would be needed, whether or not anything is needed to be done, because not all of them have something that needs to be completed. Of course, like this FAFSA one here, we don't need the student to do anything unless there are other trackings that go along with it. But there is a list of all of these trackings in the Graduate Assistant Training Manual that is located at the front desk. If you ever have time to go through those and just want to review some of them, or if you come across one when the student comes up to the front desk and really have no idea what it means, and maybe the advisor that's at the desk isn't available to speak with, you can refer to that list in the manual, and it'll tell you what the tracking is for and whether or not any documentation needs to be submitted, what the student needs to do in order to satisfy that requirement. This loan limit one, this is not necessarily something that the student has to do anything for unless there's a note on RAWCOM. It might just be that it's at E because it has not been reviewed yet. So the next place that we would go is to RAWCOM, our notes screen. We can see here that the student, we did see that tracking for the Graduate PLUS loan application. And all this note tells us is that the credit has been approved. That is an important thing to know regarding PLUS loans, what the credit decision was. It does also tell us how much was requested by the student. And it also indicates that we could not award it at the time that the application was received because the student had not been awarded their federal aid. And we can't award any PLUS loans until federal aid has been awarded first. That's what that note from our loan processing department is telling us. Now that we are on this note screen and there is some information here, I do just want to mention very briefly, of course, the date. This created date tells us when the note was initially created. This should have, and it will have to have an award year to tell us what year the note is supposed to apply to. That's especially helpful in the summer when you're dealing with two separate award years. So this summer, of course, we're still talking about 15-16, but also looking to the 16-17 fall and spring. And then it also does tell us who created the note. You will start to become familiar with these usernames. So just like your banner token, the one that we logged in with was Fineaid05. If we were to enter a note right now, which I guess we can go ahead and do, when you hit F6, it just gives you a blank note to type in. So we're going to put 16-17 and we'll just put testing. The shortcut to save our note is F10, which I have discovered I cannot hit while we're recording because it will stop the recording. So then you would just come up to this little disk, very similar to what you would see in Word, and click on that, and it will save our note. And it will move up to the top. That's really how you're going to know that your note has been saved correctly. Again, we can see here that now our user ID is what is entered there. Anytime that you see Greenwood Hall listed as a user, that's coming from our call center, which of course we hope that those notes are always correct. A lot of times they are just going off of information that they've gotten from us. In this case, they did mention to the student that they were tracked for loan limit and told them to check the NSLDS website to see why. Anytime the student's tracked for loan limit, they have exceeded a loan limit somewhere. Checking NSLDS may help them, but really that just needs to be reviewed by an advisor. And then we can see really there's nothing for this student since 2009, 2010. There was quite a gap from the last time that they were here. We'll leave our note there for now, and we'll come back to that later. If we go back to RAWREC, I just want you to be aware that RAWCOM should be the only place that you're able to enter any kind of new information. So if we were to try to track this person for award acceptance, it's not going to let us. So graduate students do not have access to add any type of new tracking. There is the possibility it might let you accidentally delete one of these, so make sure that you don't do that. But you also would not be able to even change the status of these at all. So we can't update those to an R, to an S, anything like that by accident. That's not something that you should have to worry about. This is just the first tutorial for Banner. Again, just wanted to give you a brief introduction into what it was and those three main screens. Those are probably the screens that you're going to use the most often. One of the things to keep in mind with this job is that the best way to learn is to ask a million questions. You're never going to be bothering an advisor by picking up the phone and calling them if they're at their desk. If the person that's assigned to the front desk for that day is not available, just let one of the other advisors in the back know that you need help. If you ever get an email that you don't know the answer to, definitely be sure to ask one of the advisors. And then we will have some additional tutorials for you for Banner to go through some of the additional screens that you'll be using.